Hey guys, I'm Dwayne Estes, Executive Director of the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative. My family and I have been here at a beautiful creek here on this gorgeous Saturday here in the middle of July. This is a place called Hurricane Creek. It's in Humphreys County, Tennessee, about an hour west of Nashville. And like a lot of the creeks out here, you can see that it's kind of entrenched in this shallow valley. Off behind me, you can see there's a house up on the top of that hill over about there. And the top of that hill there is probably about a couple hundred feet higher than the stream valley. And those hills roll down into the valley bottom. And then you have about a mile or a half mile wide swath of sort of stream valley that forms a long skinny valley that runs about 20 miles in this case. And eventually Hurricane Creek empties into the Duck River. What's really cool here is that, you know, if we revisit the myth of the squirrel, as we like to call it at SGI, the belief that Eastern North America at the time the Europeans first landed on our shores, that everything was covered in forest from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. If we believe in that myth, it's really hard to account for some of the things we find in these stream valleys. You know, if you ask most ecologists, they would say, that valley for sure would have been a forested valley historically. Because we can look to that river bluff right there, the small bluff across the way, and we could find sugar maples and beeches and wild hydrangeas, species that absolutely need shaded conditions. They're adapted to forests. They're growing right there on that sort of microhabitat that is that slope. Likewise, if we look across the valley, then we can see in the distance behind my car, there's a hill over there. Those hills have north-facing slopes and east-facing slopes, and they have ravines that are filled with forest-dependent species. Again, sugar maple, in some cases maybe black maple, ginseng, and a lot of the types of forest herbs that most of us are familiar with. But what we find down here in these stream valleys is somewhat of an enigma, and that is we find species like this, commonly known as the Jerusalem artichoke. It's actually not affiliated with Jerusalem, Israel at all, but rather it's a native sunflower, and this is Helianthus tuberosus. For many years, this species has been eaten for its underground tubers, rhizomes, that are very starchy and nutritious and almost potato-like. And what this brings to mind is that this valley in particular is one of the most significant valleys when it comes to thinking about Native American history. And that's because at the lower end of Hurricane Creek Valley, near where it meets the Duck River, is about the same place where the Duck River meets the Tennessee River. And that is the place where the oldest known archaeological remains have been found for sunflower. The domesticated sunflower that we all know and love. We love to eat the seeds. The sunflower was, according to archaeological records, is the oldest records for sunflower domestication occur just downstream if you're about 10 miles. So it really raises some important questions. That is, about 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, in this valley, we know that agriculture and domestication of plants was taking place sort of in the late archaic period of Native American habitation. But there's other things in this valley aside from sunflowers, which we actually don't see annual sunflower in this region anymore. There's other things here, though, that tell the story that parts of this valley were formerly more open. And this Helianthus tuberosus, while it can take some shade of a riparian woodland, by and large, it grows on the edges of streams. It grows on gravel bars. It grows at the edges of fields. It's really not a forest species in the bottomland. If it does occur in the forest, it usually does not flower. So for this species to really be reproductively, to be able to proliferate, it really is going to need a high level of sunlight. And you're talking about a high level of sunlight in an otherwise really moist, well-watered stream valley. So how do we account for that? How do we account for this species and gamma grass and so many other species down here that rely on these sort of natural disturbance to keep them open? Let's look at a couple other species as well. One is we have a lot of wild rye here in these stream valleys. This species happens to be Elymus riparius, which is oftentimes associated with riparian stream banks. Again, that's a species that likes some degree of light. It can tolerate a little bit of shade. Also, we have giant ragweed, Ambrosia trifida. A lot of people think about this as being a weedy species. It is a native weed. It's all depends on how you define that. But this is a species that doesn't really grow in forested habitats. It is a species that likes open areas of natural disturbance. So what is that open area of disturbance and how is it maintained in these valleys? Well, we can go back to a point probably at about 14,000 years ago before there were people in this part of North America. We don't know exactly when the Paleo Indians arrived, but we suspect based on the archaeological record, it was sometime around 13, 14, 15,000 years. It could have been even earlier. But in the absence of people, it's likely that these valleys would always have had some type of open component. And I'll tell you a couple things that might have done that. One, when we first pulled up to the site to come swimming, we saw a beaver that was actually swimming downstream. So beaver in a small stream like this, which is only 30 or 40 feet wide at the most, can absolutely play a profound role in terms of being ecosystem engineers. They can dam this creek, and that then can help to swell the waters outside of the floodplain. And that can flood trees and forests and kill stands of trees and open up wetlands and creates a mosaic effect of wetlands up and down this valley bottom. Another factor here then is the flooding from the actual streams themselves. And you can see a lot of this natural gravel deposition right here. So I think in between those two factors, beaver, the natural flooding regime of this stream, and then one more factor in particular, and I think the wild rye kind of speaks to this, is the importance of grazers and browsers in these stream valleys. Things like bison and elk could have played an important role. Now, the last thing I'll say is when I look around at the trees, they also sort of tell a story. In the woods behind me are things like walnut trees and mulberries, which are not really species adapted to closed canopy, full shade conditions. These are trees that are early successional species that are adapted to fairly frequent disturbance. And in order for a walnut to grow, you'll never see a walnut germinating and really growing successfully as a young tree, for example, underneath the shade of an existing forest canopy. When you find walnuts, they are usually germinating out in the open or in a very conspicuous light gap. And the same thing is true for mulberries. We find an abundance of grapevines, different species of grape, Vitis cinerea, Rhodibaliana, Vitis vulpina, the riverbank grape, are all species we could expect in this area. There's various types of dogwoods, like rough-leaf dogwood. There would have been wild plums up and down these stream valleys. So most of what we see in these valleys, on these gravel bars, on the edges of these hayfields, suggests species that are adapted to high light conditions. What we just don't know is how long have these high light conditions been here? What created those high light conditions? Again, I think it was probably a combination of several factors: beaver, natural flooding, possibly fire coming in from the upland ridges to our both sides of the stream, and certainly Native Americans would have been cultivating these valleys with corn and other kinds of agriculture starting a couple thousand years ago or so. So there are several factors which could account for this, but I think by looking at what's here, we begin to see a system that's a lot more complicated than what we may first realize. So anyways, next time you're on a gravel bar, start to think about what each of those species needs. Are they forest species? Are they open land species? I think the story in most of the valley bottoms, the broader valleys across eastern U.S., suggest an adaptation to open conditions. And I think we need to start thinking about those conditions having been at least partially open for possibly 10,000 years or more. Thanks, guys. Hope y'all have a good day.